Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive? We're going to get into the human brain this time.
Oh, yeah, always a fascinating topic, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about the most complex structure in the known universe, and we each have one.
It really makes you think. And you brought some interesting stuff to look at today, like this lecture by a neuroscientist who actually started studying the brain because of sleep paralysis.
It's amazing how these kind of unsettling experiences can really lead someone down a path of discovery.
He described sleep paralysis as literally feeling like a ghost is strangling you. I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's a powerful image, and it's exactly that kind of experience that made him want to understand how the brain could create something so bizarre. It
Yeah.
launched his whole career in neuroscience, actually.
Wow, talk about turning a nightmare into a passion project.
Uh,
But for those of us who don't spend our days thinking about neurons and synapses, could you give us the quick breakdown of how these brain cells actually work?
Okay, so think of your brain as a massive communication. We're talking billions of these tiny cells called neurons, and they're all sending and receiving electrical and chemical signals constantly.
So the neurons are like the messengers then, but how do they actually talk to each other? What's the brain language?
That's where synapses come in. They're like bridges connecting the neurons. When one neuron wants to send a message, it releases these chemical messengers, neurotransmitters, and they cross over the synapse to the receiving neuron.
Okay, so it's like a game of chemical catch across trillions of these connections.
Exactly, and it's that constant firing of messages that lets us think, feel, remember everything.
That's incredible. We've got this whole world inside our heads orchestrating everything we are. But it also makes you wonder what makes us different from, say, our primate cousins. We're pondering our own existence here.
He actually talks about this thing called the police officer gene. It basically determines brain size and complexity.
Wait, so there's a gene that sets us apart from chimps. Just one.
It's pretty remarkable when you think about it, how much one single gene can influence our cognitive abilities.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about nature versus nurture.
Yeah, you always hear about that debate, but to have it come down to something like one gene is pretty wild.
It is. And it also shows that size isn't everything. Elephants have bigger brains than us, but they aren't necessarily smarter.
It's not about the size of the brain, it's how you use it. But how do we even start to understand how all those neural connections actually create the human experience?
What gets really interesting here, it's about understanding the little things. For example, there's myelin, which is a fatty substance that coats neurons. It's like insulation, almost like the plastic coating on electrical wires.
So myelin is like insulation for the brain, but what does that actually do for us?
Think of it this way. The thicker the myelin, the faster those electrical signals can travel, like upgrading from dial-up to high-speed internet for your brain.
Makes sense. So what happens if our myelin isn't in good shape? What causes that?
Believe it or not, stress can actually damage myelin. It's like stripping the insulation off your brain's wiring. Imagine how much slower your thinking would be.
Wow, that's scary. It makes you realize how important stress management is.
But speaking of things that affect our mental state, makes you wonder how much of our mental clarity and being comes down to the insulation around our neurons.
It really is fascinating, and it shows how connected our minds and bodies really are. But speaking of things that impact our mental state, we can't forget about those chemical messengers in the brain.
You mean like dopamine and serotonin? The
Yeah.
ones you always hear about?
Exactly. They play such a huge role in our moods, our motivations, even how we see the world.
Didn't I read somewhere that there are actually different types of pleasure linked to dopamine? Is that something he talks about?
Yeah, he makes a distinction between anticipatory pleasure and consummatory pleasure. So anticipatory pleasure is that excitement you feel when you're looking forward to something like opening a present or waiting for a tasty meal. So that's all about the dopamine.
It's all about the possibility of a reward. But then you have consummatory pleasure, which is that feeling of satisfaction when you actually get the reward, like taking that first bite of food.
So dopamine gets us going, and then something else takes over once we're actually there.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It just shows how dynamic these chemicals are in shaping our experiences. But it's not all about pleasure, right? They're also involved in attention motivation, bonding, even how we feel pain.
Oh, yeah, that reminds me, there was that story in the lecture about President Reagan being shot and not feeling it at the time. Is that connected to these chemicals too?
It is. He says Reagan's lack of pain was probably due to a rush of endorphins, the body's natural painkillers.
It's amazing how our brains can block out pain like that in extreme situations.
Makes you think about what evolutionary purpose that might serve. Maybe it helps us survive by letting us focus on escaping instead of the pain.
That's a pretty intense thought, but it definitely shows the power of the brain. And it makes me think about things like acupuncture. how they might tap into those pain relief systems.
That's a great point. He actually talks about how acupuncture might work by stimulating endorphin release. It's a cool example of how ancient practices and modern science can come together.
It is. Reminds you that we don't have all the answers, and there could be a lot more to those traditional practices than we think.
And speaking of different perspectives, he also talks about how the brain is modular, with different areas responsible for different functions.
So are you saying our brains are like those old switchboards with different sections lighting up for different tasks?
Kind of, yeah. He talks about modules for language vision math, even a part that's active when you're calculating a tip.
So it's like our brains are these complex machines with specialized parts.
It's a good analogy, but here's the thing. While the brain is modular, those modules don't work alone. They're constantly talking to each other, influencing each other in ways we're still figuring out.
So it's more nuanced than just saying this part does this and that part does that.
Exactly. And to illustrate that, he uses this example called the rubber hand illusion. So they'll have someone hide one hand, and then they put a realistic-looking rubber hand in front of them. Then they stroke both the hidden hand and the rubber hand at the same time. And because the brain is getting visual input from the rubber hand and touch input from the real hand, it starts to blend those experiences. Eventually, it feels like the rubber hand is part of their body.
Wow, that's so strange. It's like your brain is saying, it looks like my hand and it feels like my hand, so it must be my hand.
Exactly. It just shows how adaptable our brains are, how they can change with new information and experiences.
That's incredible.
But it's not just a neat trick, right? There are real applications for this research.
He talks about how understanding these illusions could help us treat things like OCD and even chronic pain. So like instead of having someone with OCD actually touch something that makes them anxious, they could use the rubber hand thing to create the same feeling, but in a safe way.
Exactly. Using the brain's own tricks to rewire those pathways. And it's not just for OCD either. He even mentions using it for chronic pain, like migraines. Imagine tricking your brain into turning down the volume on that pain.
That would be amazing. There's so much we don't know about the brain, but also so much potential for helping people.
Definitely. Every new discovery gets us closer to understanding what makes us human and how we can improve our lives with that knowledge.
It really makes you think. We often think of the brain as this fixed thing, but it's constantly changing and adapting.
That's right. It's always evolving based on our experiences, our choices, even our imaginations.
So it's not just about the science, it's about realizing we have the power to shape our own minds.
And he brings up this fascinating idea towards the end of his lecture, the concept of a body image module in the brain.
Body image. Now that's something I'd love to explore further.
Makes you wonder, how does our brain create our sense of self? How do we know what's me and what's not? And what happens when those lines get blurry?
That's a question that goes way beyond just neuroscience. It gets into philosophy, psychology, even consciousness itself.
Exactly. The brain is the ultimate mystery, isn't it? Even with everything we've learned, we're just scratching the surface.
I think our brains have definitely gotten a workout today. That's for sure. What really struck me is that the brain isn't static. It's constantly changing and adapting based on our experiences.
And that's what makes it so amazing. There's always more to discover, always another layer to uncover, always another question to ask.
I love that. So keep those brains firing, everyone. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.